This is FLOSS Weekly. I'm Doc Searls. This week, Jonathan Bennett, Aaron Newcomb, and I are going to be talking about open source in the workplace, including business models, open source hardware, retro, lots of other topics. It's a hot show, and that's coming up next.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is FLOSS Weekly, episode 617, recorded Wednesday, February 17th, 2021. Open source in the workplace. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Linode. Simplify your cloud infrastructure and cut your cloud bills in half. Get started on Linode today with $100 in free credit. Text TWiT to 474747 or visit linode.com/floss and click on the Create Free Account button to get started. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to FLOSS Weekly. I am Doc Searls, and with me this morning, our guests are each other, and in this case, it is Aaron Newcomb and Jonathan Bennett, who, there they are. There's Aaron. There's Jonathan.
Hey.
Good morning, gents.
Morning, Doc.
Let's just run it down. We're going to do a left to right here for those watching on video. I'm in Santa Barbara, California, where everything remains perfect, unlike the whole rest of the country. And how about you guys?
Yeah, I'm in my my home office as usual. And no, that's not a roll of toilet paper. Oh, sorry, other shoulder. That's not a roll of toilet paper there. It's an air purifier. So I'm not in my bathroom. Thank you very much. But I just noticed, I looked over my shoulder and I'm like, that looks just like a roll of toilet paper. It is not, folks. Don't worry.
And I am in Southwest Oklahoma. I am kind of right in the heart of where this cold snap has hit. And a couple of nights ago, I believe we set our coldest weather ever recorded in the town where I live. It hit -12. And the previous all-time low was -11, which for those of you that live, further up north is nothing. But the houses around here are not built for that. And several of us have had problems. A good friend of mine has had a pipe burst because it froze, and it's just not a good time for us poor Southerners.
Yeah,
I'm sure there's a lot of that going on.
Yeah. Our friend Catherine is in Houston, which is has a water crisis. These people have air conditioning; they don't have heat in a lot of cases, and And I was hearing stories, and these are for Texas, but it's the next state over from Oklahoma. Oklahoma is people putting cattle in their cars, and and indoors and stuff like that because they're that's the only way to save them. They're not. I guess some breeds of cattle are not built to freeze. At least not while they're still alive.
Yeah, not that cold.
Anyway, yeah. So we're going to discuss news this morning, but we're going to save the stories ahead of the show until we have the show itself. And in the meantime, this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Linode. Managing your complex cloud infrastructure shouldn't be hard. Linode believes in cloud computing for all. Simplify your cloud infrastructure with Linode's Linux virtual machines and develop, deploy, and scale your modern applications faster and easier. Why do over 800,000 developers choose Linode? Well, there's intuitive cloud manager and full-featured API. Linode has data centers around the world with the same simple and consistent pricing, regardless of location. Choose the data center nearest you. And they have award-winning customer support 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, with no tiers or handoffs, regardless of your plan size. Think of all the things you can do. Host your website, build your app, store or backup media. It's up to you. Easily launch and enrich your developer applications, hosted services, websites, AI and machine learning workloads, gaming services, or CI/CD environments. Launch and scale in the cloud with their virtual machines. You can choose shared and dedicated compute instances, or you can use your $100 in credit on S3-compatible object storage, managed Kubernetes, and more. Be sure to check out Linode's new YouTube channel for video tutorials, security tips, and more at youtube.com/Linode. Bryce Adams from Metric says, from the start, we were looking for a partner, not a provider. Some of the large providers see us only as a transaction. Linode is the kind of partner that will be with us from the start, today and beyond. Simplify your infrastructure and cut your cloud bills in half with Linode's Linux virtual machines. Whether you're developing a personal project or managing larger workloads, you deserve simple, affordable, and accessible cloud computing solutions. Get started on Linode today with $100 in free credit for listeners of FLOSS Weekly. You can find all the details at linode.com/floss. Not at your desktop? Simply text TWiT to 474747 to get your free credit, linode.com/floss, and click on the Create Free Account button to get started. If it runs on Linux, it runs on Linode. Okay, gents, here we are with each other, and not a guest this week. And we have news. We have news to go over, and so I'm going to start alphabetically with Aaron. What have you got there, Aaron?
Yeah, the first thing I wanted to talk about is, we talk a lot on this show and other shows about the misperception that you can't make money with open source. And we also talk about, the skill set that you need with open source. And so that you can make money by knowing open source. So not just by making an open source product, but by knowing open source, you're actually more valuable as a employee. And what was interesting to me is IBM actually came out. They did a survey with O'Reilly. They partnered with O'Reilly to do a survey. I don't normally talk about survey, but there's some good stats in here that if you're an engineer or an ops person and you know open source, you might want to bring these up in your next review with your manager. Maybe give you a little bit of fodder. But essentially what they found at the high level is that employers want to hire people that know open source. And more that's becoming prevalent. The more you are aware of open source and can use open source effectively to do your job, the more likely you are to get hired. So, for example, some of the stats that came out in this is 60% of respondents preferred skills related to the underlying open source technologies such as Linux, Kubernetes, and Istio, while 36% preferred skills related to a specific cloud platform, who also, of course, use a lot of open source. 65% of respondents agree that contributions to open source projects impress potential employers and result in better professional opportunities. So there's a lot of good quotes in here. The fact that they actually surveyed, employers, real users about different types of, and if you scroll down, Ant, there's some graphs as well that are kind of interesting. But the fact that they went out and actually surveyed and they're getting responses that say, yes, open source is really important to us, I think is a big deal, right? Because when we first started, I'm assuming that everybody, Jonathan included, we're going to age you a little bit, Jonathan, but okay. I'll speak for myself. When I first started with Linux back in the 90s, if I walked into an employer and say, hey, I know how to set up Red Hat on a server, they would have been like, so what, right? That's not actually a skill that I'm looking for. But now that's completely changed. What do you guys think about the importance of open source skills?
It sure depends on, there's still some places where you can walk into. I've had this experience where you walk in and you tell somebody you know Linux and they look at you and they go, what's that? But then there's other places where that's their entire shop. And I was reading something about this not too long ago. Wasn't Google kind of the leader on this? One of the first big businesses to say we're gonna go all in on using Linux for our servers on our desktops. The article I was reading was making the comment that Microsoft used to have a lot of leverage over businesses, because they put out the license on all the operating system that everybody used everywhere. And Google was one of the first people that said, no, we're not going to play that game. And Microsoft would try to push them around and they laughed at them. And, Aaron, you may know, or Doc, even you may know better than I do, kind of the history of that. But, I think Google was one of the first places to do that. But it's interesting to see that kind of business model, as it's spread and there's more and more shops that are going, hybrid as far as what they run on their desktops and their servers, or even just going all in on Linux?
Well, when Google was two guys in a bike shop in downtown Palo Alto, they used Linux. I mean, from the start, they were Linux hackers, and they scaled up what they were doing entirely on Linux. And I remember visiting one of their data centers early on when they were in what's now their whole campus, a lot of which they kind of inherited from Sun Microsystems as they grew and Sun shrank. But the first to really push it, I mean, they didn't talk about it. They didn't even need to. It was just like, this is what's here and we're using it. It was IBM. And the interesting story there was that I think it was maybe in 98 or 99 or 2000, I forget exactly which year it was, but IBM showed up at Linux World. It was a Linux World. It lasted several years. It was very active. It was at Moscone Center in San Francisco. And IBM showed up as like, here are these guys with shiny shoes and dark suits and white shirts, and they were just pushing WebSphere, and they were saying, well, we're checking out Linux and we're putting it under WebSphere. Our WebSphere server runs Linux, and they didn't make too big a deal of it. And the next time they were there, the next Linux World, they had beanbag chairs and Ethernet all over the floor, and they went out of their way to say, we are all about Linux, And I remember asking them, we had this big meeting. The first time they had like two guys, and the second time they had this giant booth and like 16 people in a room. And I said, what happened? In a little conference room where they were briefing the press, and I asked them, what happened to you guys here? And they said, well, we did a survey. And when IBM does a survey, they only survey themselves, So they said, we surveyed one of our engineering divisions, and we found that, and we surveyed for 6 levels of Linux awareness, and the bottom level is can spell Linux, and the top level was hacks kernel code. And they said, we found that everybody could spell Linux, and 150 people out of 600 were hacking kernel code, were involved in some ways in the kernel. And what they realized was that their engineers were already heavily using Linux. They just went into compliance with their own engineers. I mean, they didn't have to. They bragged about spending $2 billion on promoting Linux, but nobody ever counted that up. They just basically, it was a PR move on their part. But it was sincere. There was a guy named Dan Fry, who was a great source for us for a number of years and ran a big IBM division, I think, in Portland, Oregon. And he said, in fact, it took 6 years for IBM to realize they actually couldn't tell their kernel hackers what to do, that it would actually work the other way around. And I think that's, I wonder now actually whether or not that's still the case, because the big companies are all involved with the Linux Foundation, and I think it's a different ecosystem than it used to be. And the kind of independent hackers, I mean, the guys who inside, I mean, one of the things I was told by John Terpstra of Samba, I mean, he was big on Samba at the time, was that something like many millions of old IBM boxes, old PCs had turned into Samba boxes inside of IBM, basically kind of emulating Microsoft. And so I don't know if that happens now. I don't know if that happens in the same way. I wonder a bit about hacker culture. But on the business model front, I think the primary ethic in it is that you make money because of Linux. You don't make money with Linux. I mean, it's what you do one layer up on top of it that's making you money. Now, again, there are forms of Linux that are sold. There's no doubt about that at the distribution level, but most of the money that's made around Linux is made because of it rather than with it. It's just it's kind of like, you have a house because of 2x4s and lumber and trees, but it's not. Those aren't really making money for the house, or a business. It's it's infrastructural material rather than something else, and that's been the hard part. I mean, I don't think having a business model sells anymore with open source. It's kind of like it's a given that that you make money because of it rather than with it. But it's still tough. It's still it is still tough in some cases, but I think for the most part we've moved past it.
Yeah, I think that's mostly true. What you're saying there, Doc. You know, it's not how big your Linux box is; it's how you use it, kind of thing. But I can tell you that it's a competitive differentiator for us. The company that I work for, Sysdig, who thank you, Sysdig, for giving me some time to be here, by the way. But for us, it's a competitive differentiator to know that the code that we're building is based on open source, where somebody else's code may be proprietary. So from not the Linux angle necessarily, but from the open source angle, it certainly is a competitive differentiator. And you know, a lot of our customers are tech focused, and even the financial customers we have, the teams we work with are their tech guys, right? But they prefer a solution, even if it's a commercial solution that's based on open source. It gives them the comfort level that they need to be able to deploy, which sounds, you know, 10, 20 years ago would have sounded weird. But today it's like, no, I can go back and check the code. I can file an issue with the source code. And I know that source code, since you're based on open source, you know, that issue will bubble its way up into the commercial product as well. So yeah, interesting times we live in. I'm certainly glad that this whole movement has gotten to this point.
So let me ask you guys a question, because it's along this line in a way. Somebody asked me the other day, in respect to the hacking that has gone on inside the U.S. government, right? So bad actors have come in, and there's this gigantic thing and nobody even begins to know how far this goes or how deep it goes. And the question I was asked was, is this easier to solve for the systems that are open source, that are based on open source, than it is for the ones that are based on closed? And I think the answer is yes. And you're nodding, Aaron. So why don't you take that
totally. So I've given several presentations on this where I bring up the SolarWinds thing, right? You know, SolarWinds is closed source. Somebody was able to take advantage, from what I understand. I'm sure there's more people understand this better than I do, but from my understanding, basically people were able to insert some code in one of the versions that was just sitting out there and nobody was updating it, right? And so in the open source world, the way this would have worked is somebody would have issued a bug a long time ago, probably when that version was first released. They would have either opened an issue on GitHub or something, and they would have said, hey, there's this problem, and it would have gotten fixed. Most likely. I mean, it's not a guarantee, but there's a higher degree, there's a higher chance that problem would have gotten fixed if the code was open source.
There is. I'll jump in because there is actually more to that story. I assume we're talking about SolarWinds. It's a little bit more complicated than that, Aaron. Apparently, there was a piece of malware that was. It seems to have been written by, you know, a state agency at some other government. Hard to tell exactly which one of them. I'll give you two guesses, though. That got installed on developers' machines. And this piece of malware did one thing, and it watched for compiling processes. And it would go out, and when the code for the SolarWinds boxes got compiled, it would temporarily modify a piece of source code, wait for the compiler to pass it, and then change it back. So it was not a permanent change to their source code. It was a temporary change. So it's not quite as simple as, oh, somebody could have seen this in the source. But what I will point out, what would have caught this is if they had their stuff open source and people were doing reproducible builds, then exactly. the hash at the end would have been different, and somebody on the outside could have, you know, essentially redone the steps to build it and then compared it against what was running on the boxes. That would have caught it. But SolarWinds was a very, you know, when it first hit the news, SolarWinds came out and said, oh, we've been hit by an extremely sophisticated hack. And, you know, kind of everybody in the security community went, yeah, sure you were. That's what everybody says. Every hack is really sophisticated when it's against you. But no, this one was actually pretty impressive. There was a lot of engineering that went into the SolarWinds hack.
Yeah, I don't want to bash a company too much. I will say that I interviewed at SolarWinds one time. And what they told me was, I said, well, how much support do you give to customers? And now, not for all their products, but at least for the ones that I was interviewing for. And they said, none. We don't give any support. You pay for it, you use it. If you like it, you keep it. If you don't, you get rid of it. So I was like, okay, see you later. I couldn't deal with that kind of business model, but I still think that the open source, even thanks for those additional details, Jonathan, by the way, but I think that open source still would have caught that, right? Like you say, somebody would have cross-compiled this or compiled it on their own systems and tested it out, and they would have seen that hash didn't match. But with proprietary software, there's no opportunity to do that.
It kind of comes down to what's knowable here. If you're investigating something, you want to know what's going on. And open source is inherently more knowable than the closed source kind is.
Yeah.
So, next story. Jonathan, you got something there?
Oh, so I came across this a couple of weeks ago, and we haven't talked about it yet. It's the Raspberry Pi. A hacker, a security researcher, Vivek Gite. I do not know how to pronounce his name. He wrote up an article. He noticed that on his official Raspberry Pi OS, he did an update, and a repository got added to his box from Microsoft. And Linux guys, open source guys have not necessarily had the best relationship with Microsoft over the years, and some of the community is really, really upset about this. Now, the reason this repository exists and the reason that it got added to Raspberry Pi OS is because the Raspberry Pi is, very much an educational and development platform, and the guys there said, hey, wouldn't it be nice if people could just run a single command to be able to install VS Code, which is an open source project, and a lot of people really like VS Code. And so there's this, I don't know what exactly to call it, but there's this very much a difference of opinion as to whether it was appropriate for the Raspberry Pi Foundation to add the Microsoft repo into Raspberry Pi OS. What do you guys think?
Well, I'll jump in first, but I can definitely say that this didn't worry me as much. It certainly blew up, though. Very quickly. There's still Microsoft animosity out there. even with their, Microsoft, to their credit, has done a really good job over the past 4 or 5 years becoming Linux friendly, right? They run Linux. You can run Linux on their cloud platform, Azure. You can run Linux. I'm running Linux on my Windows platform that I'm using right now. And they're contributing a lot more to open source. So I have less animosity towards Microsoft. Back in the day, I was a huge bigot, right? Even though I had to use Windows, I preferred Linux and tried to, that's the whole reason I'm on this show, right? That's the whole reason I started co-hosting the show, whatever it was, 15 years ago, was because I wanted to be a proponent of open source. Mm-hmm. Anyway, this didn't worry me as much, though. To me, there was nothing really sneaky about it. But I think that the Raspberry Pi Foundation underestimated the amount of animosity that's still out there in the community, for sure.
Yeah, I'm looked through this story, and I think in a larger sense, it's just a matter of it's going to take probably a long time before Microsoft fully adjusts to being an alpha in a world that was not of their creation, and really, I mean, that's basically what it is. I mean, they were an avowed enemy of open source early on, and Bill Gates in particular was, and I think even he's changed at this point. He was an avowed enemy of the internet even at the very beginning, and turned on a dime on that one. That all took less than a year, but it's going to take some time for that, and I think it's easy for a big company to think, oh, we got this, we're going to step into this thing, and we got to think for that, and to some degree, in naively not necessarily paying attention to what the community wants, whatever that is, So I'm willing to cut. I mean, I think at this point where Microsoft comes from, and I get this, I'm talking to a number of people there. We had some on the show a few weeks back. Is we're in this thing now. We're adjusting. It's taken some time, but this is what we care about, and it's gonna take a while before we're fully adjusted and a truly big player here. And what is it like to be that big player now? It isn't just IBM and Red Hat and and SUSE and the other familiars. It's these guys who are in some ways bigger than all of them, to begin with. So it's a period of adjustment.
Yeah, I kind of think in this case, in retrospect, and I'm wondering if the Raspberry Pi guys would agree with this, in retrospect, adding that repository probably should have been done in conjunction with like a minor version bump of the OS. Like I know with CentOS and Red Hat, you go from 8.1 to 8.2, and it's a seamless transition, but there's enough of a change that they go ahead and they called a new number. And messing with people's repositories does make people nervous because you put a lot of trust in that. And so I don't know, maybe adding a repository needs to be something that is just publicly announced across the board, whether it's Microsoft or not. The fellow that wrote the article made one point that's interesting, but I don't think it's very important, and that is because you've got this repository set up now, you send a ping off to Microsoft servers every time you run updates, which I don't think most of us really care about. But then he made another point that I think is relevant, and that is when you download VS Code, when you get the binaries for VS Code, you are not getting just the open source project. You're getting Microsoft's compilation of the open source project that does include some tracking software. And so VS Code is very similar to the way VS Code works in relation to their open source project is very similar to how Chrome works in relationship to Chromium. And in fact, there's a website that I was introduced to that I think is very interesting. Now, I've not vetted this entirely, but VS Codium is a place where you can get reproducible binaries that is just the open source VS Code. And it seems like maybe that would be the better place to go to, particularly if the idea of a little bit of tracking from Microsoft really sticks in your craw like it does in some of us. So I think that's probably my big tip that I took away from this story is that VS Codium is the place to go to.
Yeah, the points made. Yeah, the points made in the story is under point 4 and 5 under why this is bad news. Every apt-get update command ping back goes to the repository, and it adds, if you or any family members are logged into the Microsoft ecosystem through GitHub, Bing, Office Live, or whatever, they can identify and track you using the same shared public IP at home. This is, I think also this is a kind of a big company thing too. There's an assumption on the part of lots of operators that tracking people is fine, and that it's better to track people for lots of good reasons. We can protect them, stuff like that, no matter what. But you're dealing with hackers here, and they may not like that. So this is again, as part of the learning process.
Isn't that true of any repository, though? I mean, it's not just specific to Microsoft, right? I mean, anytime you do an apt-get and you go out and ping, you can track that someone is hitting your server and get their IP address, essentially. At least their public IP address.
Yeah, I think the point he was getting at, though, is that Microsoft has a bit of a bad track record with how they track people and do telemetry and all of those things.
Yeah. I don't know. I never.
In the business.
I never. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I just said they're in the business to some degree.
Oh,
there are many
businesses,
for sure. That's one of them. Yeah.
I never fully subscribed to the idea that distributions had to be completely 100% free of open source or free of proprietary software. I know that distributions still release that way. I think it's good that there's all open source. That you can run a completely open platform if you want to. But I just never subscribed to the point that you have to be complete. It should be a choice, right? I want to go out and I want to install my NVIDIA, proprietary drivers for my video card. I should be able to do that, and I do. But I also would be happy with installing a distribution that was highly customized to get the most performance out of my rig that already had those drivers in there, as long as there was some place I could go to see what they were.
Mm. Yeah, well, it's definitely important that, and this is basically what you just said, but it's definitely important that there are distros out there that are entirely open source, because you get into some strange things like, if you've got a distro that comes with NVIDIA's drivers baked in, then you agree to NVIDIA's terms of service just by installing the distro. There are some weird edge cases like that where, potentially people could get tripped up, legally speaking, down the road. So I am glad that Fedora is one of the big ones that, ships entirely open source. I'm glad it exists. I'm glad that in Fedora it is relatively easy to go and add a repository where you can get closed source software. But I think it's also a great thing that, Pop! OS and that sort of family of distros exist that comes with all that stuff baked into it.
Yeah, Keith 512 in the chat room says that he runs Manjaro ARM, the ARM version of Manjaro on his Raspberry Pi, and he really likes that. So there are, like you say, there are alternatives out there if you don't like having a Microsoft repository, or just take it out. You can remove it.
That's true.
So we have a few other stories listed here. One of you guys want to pick up on one of your additional ones there? I could. I see Aaron.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go for it, Aaron.
I'll go next. I just wanted to talk about the. I've been spending a lot of time with this open source and open hardware project lately called RGB to HDMI. So most people know. If you don't know by now, I started. I've been interested in vintage computers for a while, but lately I've really been getting back to my roots. So much so that I started a YouTube channel called Retro Hack Shack, where I work on these systems, bring them back to life, fix them, clean them, whatever they need. And one of the projects that I've been doing, I did 4 episodes now about this, is called RGB to HDMI. So one of the issues with older systems is that they, you have the video output, the video technology at that time was either composite. A lot of times it was RF modulators that you had to use to connect it to a TV, right? And the quality of the video is pretty poor. And over time, capacitors degrade. The output can get even worse over time. And so a lot of times, like people will add composite mods or RGB mods to systems. Well, this particular project has taken a Raspberry Pi Zero and then built an additional daughter board, I guess called a hat. If people are still, that's what Raspberry Pi was calling them. I don't know if people are still referring to them that way. But they added on, let me grab one. Actually, I've got one right here. A little visual demonstration. So this is a Raspberry Pi and a little daughter board on top, right? And what this allows you to do is it connects to your, YUV or RGB output of your old system and then converts it through the Raspberry Pi to HDMI. So now you can connect an HDMI display up to your old system and get, I don't know how high. I know it goes at least to 1080p quality. And it's pixel perfect. And there's a lot of other cool additional things you can do with it as well. For example, the PAL version of the Coco, right? So the Tandy or Radio Shack color computer, the PAL version of that was never able to take advantage of the NTSC artifacting, which is a way of shifting colors. The Apple II did this as well. The way of shifting colors in the signal to give you colors where there weren't any before, right? So it was kind of a hacky way of getting colors on those systems. Well, the PAL version could never take advantage of that because they weren't running NTSC. They were running PAL, so it never looked right. But because it's going through the Raspberry Pi in the setup, when you hook up one of these, you can emulate those NTSC artifacts even in the PAL version. So not only do you get HDMI output, but you get, at least in Europe, you get access to these NTSC color artifacting that you weren't able to get before. So just really a really, really cool project. Like I said, the project is open source. The hardware is open hardware. I built up my boards myself. And the developers, again, because it's open source, they're getting immediate feedback. And so I've been working with some of the developers for building out, for example, the color computer support I mentioned. We just go back and forth. I think we got that worked out in less than a week, and all of a sudden we have a new system that this board can support. So I think it supports like about 20 different old systems right now. And I just wanted to bring it up as a great example of open source, open hardware project that is really benefiting the community especially this community, the retro system community, in being able to bring these old systems either back to life or improve them in a way that makes them much more usable with the current technology today.
Now, with RGB support, does that mean that even things like old consoles that have a SCART output can get plugged into this thing? So that you can take, like, say, a Super Nintendo through SCART to your Raspberry Pi and then up to your big screen?
So so it gets a little complicated. Once you get to the past the original NES level, then the speed or the speed of the signals, the frequency of the signals gets so fast that it's difficult for this board to be able to pick them up. Because what this does is it compares voltage levels, right? So it's sitting there monitoring the voltage levels of all these signals. And when you get to Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, some of those systems, the speed is so fast, it just can't detect the voltage changes in between the cycles. So so you get to a certain point and you're not able to use it anymore. You'll have to switch to something with an FPGA on it. This runs off of CPLD. So sorry, we're getting in the acronym weeds there for those that aren't into this, but you can think of if you've heard of FPGA boards that do all the emulation, really super fast systems that can emulate some of those older technologies. CPLD is like one step below that, but it's also relatively cheap. So I think I built up my board for, I want to say less than $30 all in, including ordering the PCBs, ordering all the parts. And I use it on a ton of systems now. My old IBM stuff that has CGA and EGA output, I use it for. Like I said, I've used it for the color computer. It supports, BBC Micro, and there's even mods you can get so that it'll support Amiga and Commodore 64. Those take a little bit more work, but I've just been really impressed by this project. And I keep going back to the fact that this type of project would not be doable if it wasn't open source and open hardware. Because even if you put something like this on let's say you created it and then you wanted to get it out in the world, the iteration just would not be possible like it is since it's open source and open hardware. So really impressed by this, and kudos to the developers that are working on this behind the scenes. They're doing a great job.
So I sent a note on our little back channel. I have to share something here that's not exactly. It's just my own background. I just found this. This is a Popular Electronics from July 1976, probably before you guys were born, and it says
not
on
me.
the front. Okay, now you can build a high-quality intelligent terminal, and with a cassette here and this display. But here's the cool thing, and this is one reason I bought this way back when. Here's your ad for an Altair, the original Altair.
Nice.
Isn't that cool? Is that beyond cool?
That is awesome.
And it even has this this thing, free technical information. I can mail this in, and get something. And on the back of it, check this out. I think that's actually. Oh no, it looked like one of the things you stuck in the middle of a 45.
No, there's MITS.
Anyway,
yeah, the MITS logo.
But it's the
That's
MITS
awesome.
Altair, the actual MITS Altair.
Yeah.
And I so wanted one of those, and so a whole lot of other things that happened. But anyway, a little bit of geology from my garage that I ran across.
That's awesome. I love that. We have by the way, Doc, I don't know if you remember the Soul system by Proctech.
Yeah,
we've got a Soul system at the Makerspace.
Oh my God!
That is in working condition. One of our members bought the kit and built it. So yeah, similar to the Altair.
Yeah, so I mean, and this is unrelated to that, but related to the retro topic. Like a lot of people who are becoming at least in a tech way, elderly, I have VHS, high 8, and mini DV tapes that I would love to dub over to digital form, to whatever is best. And I actually have, like the old, the machines it was shot on. I mean, I have the things that were the camcorders and so forth. And I actually have over there a Sony, I think it's mini DV. It's the mini DV deck. And there's actually a hack for fixing those. They're old enough that the caps that the rubber in various parts don't work. And there's even there's a particular hack where you take like the the inside of a ballpoint pen and the sleeve that the ink is in, and you do something with one of those. Ended up sending it to, there's like one outfit somewhere near Chicago that actually fixes these things. So a friend of mine and I, the guy who owns the deck, and I have thus far spent about $600 on having these things fixed. But then dubbing them over is another bear. You know, in this case, I've got an old Mac over there that has the FireWire connection that goes to the FireWire connection in this Sony Mini DV thing. So it's a pain. But anyway, it's worthwhile to do. But I just thought I'd mention that that's sort of my own half-done retro project.
Well, it's a lot of fun. I know we need to get back to open source, but one of the things that draws people to this is that it is accessible. The hardware is accessible, or was a lot more accessible back then than it is now. So you can pick up a Commodore 64 and you can look at the board and you can identify what does what, right? Each chip has its own function and you can figure it out. And it, you know, it takes some doing, but you can fix it. And it's a lot of fun. In the community, the retro community, I have found anyway, it has been nothing but amazing. Everybody's super nice. Everybody's willing to help out and lend a suggestion for fixing something. I haven't gotten, well, I don't want to jinx it. I haven't gotten any trolls on my YouTube channel yet, and it's growing like crazy. So I think it's really a credit to those folks in that community. They want to talk about technology and they don't care about the other stuff really.
Is there in, I mean, I sense, I mean, maybe I'm wrong about this, but the yearn to go back to vinyl, for example, and other things like that. And I'm wondering if retro in general is becoming a bigger and bigger topic as less and less of some of the ordinary things that we use are accessible. You want to get inside a TV or something, you know. I mean, our TV downstairs that we got in 2006 came with a big thing explaining that there is in fact free software in here. You can't get at it, but there is some, and we have to let you know. Our lawyers are making you know that. They didn't even come with that anymore. But there's no doubt I can't get in that thing. I don't want to fix it. You know, had a Sony thing had 8 HDMI ports on it. So far, 2 of them are gone. You know, so I'm not going to fix it. You know? Well,
just as a learning tool. Like I said, having that hardware be more accessible. If you want to learn about electronics, going retro is a great way to do it, because you'll learn about op amps, you'll learn about power supplies, you'll learn about all these things that, you know, if you want to start with today's technology, it's just a little bit harder to learn. It's not you can't do it, you can, but as a learning tool, those old systems are really great.
Well, you know, I used to work on cars. I mean, when I got out of college, I had a Volkswagen, and I had 2 of them actually, and they were easy to fix. They were air cooled. You know, you get two guys in a 6-pack and tear this thing down. And I would work on only 327 and 283 Chevy V8s with Hollier Rochester carburetors. I knew what those were, right? And I never spent over $250 for a car because every one I got was used. The background noise, there's somebody else in the house is using the printer right now, mindless of the fact that I'm actually on the air, as it were. Anyway, and my wife just got a new car. The one is printing right now. It just got a new car, and I just discovered it has, you know, it's a hybrid, and it has 2 engines in it. It has an eco, a normal, and a sport mode, and it actually changes the steering ratio. And I can't imagine ever fixing that. I don't know how one would do it. I can't get into that. And I, you know, I lament the days when you could tear your car down and see what was in it and fix it, because it's not possible now. I guess you could bring it into the dealer and they'll charge you $2,000 to make some minor fix. But I think in tech it's a similar thing, and more of it's disposable now, which is also weird.
Yeah, it's weird and it's unfortunate. Those things are getting thrown into landfills.
Yeah, believe it or not, we cover it on Hackaday from time to time. There are still people that get down into that and work on it and hack on it. You know, one of the stories that we see every once in a while is somebody will take a wrecked Tesla and you know, very slowly pull out the parts that are broken beyond repair and then replace the battery pack, or, you know, do whatever needs to be done to it, and have, you know, either a new like new working Tesla, or they'll take the parts from the Tesla and go put it into something else. So there are guys that still get into it and that do stuff like that. It's just it's almost like the barrier to entry is higher. The systems are more complicated, and so it takes someone that's just about got an engineering degree or is willing to give themselves the self-education of an equivalent of an engineering degree to be able to actually get in there and do all that. So I think there is something to be said for the simpler, obviously less capable, but also less complicated systems that retro computing is all about.
Yep.
There. I muted myself because I wanted to send a note to who's printing to please stop, because I don't know how to make it stop other than turning it off. And then anyway, so one of you guys has an additional story or wanted to carry on while I mute myself for a moment. So go do that.
Sure, I can jump in. So there's something that I've been watching for, I think, a couple of years now, actually, and that's FPGAs and open source. So I know Aaron knows something about this as well. He was talking about it just a minute ago. FPGAs are, first off, they're awesome, and they get used in lots and lots of things, places where you wouldn't see them. You don't ever see them. You don't know that they're there. But just about every piece of relatively complicated hardware you've got has an FPGA in it somewhere doing something. Doc was talking about his, 8 HDMI inputs. Well, the thing that multiplexes those HDMIs is probably an FPGA chip, field programmable gate array. And these things have been locked up with closed source and proprietary software for a long time. And there's been about 3 things that have happened in the last few years that is really starting to make a change. First off, Intel bought Altera. AMD has acquired Xilinx, and those are the two of the biggest FPGA players, and they have both been acquired by very open source friendly companies. Both Intel and AMD put a lot of effort into their open source support for their products. And then the third, and I don't remember as many details about this as I should. There was, and this has been years ago now, one of the simpler FPGAs, a group of academics kind of brute forced their way into a fully open source tool chain. And so one of the interesting things that I've been watching is this, really exciting realm of FPGAs that used to be entirely closed source. I mean, some of them were so bad that to be able to even get your hands on the tools to work with them, you had to sign an NDA. You had to sign a non-disclosure agreement to be able to work on them at all. Are now moving towards the point of anybody can get their hands on one, anybody can get their hands on an open source tool chain and just absolutely jump in and start working on them. And it makes things like Aaron's project there possible, because 10 years ago you need an FPGA for that. There's no way that Aaron would be able to buy enough bulk to be able to get the attention of Xilinx or whoever to sign the NDA and get the tool chain to work on it.
Yeah, Xilinx makes the CPLDs I was mentioning before. I know they make FPGAs as well, but they make the CPLDs that I'm using for those projects. And I've still got a Tinker board up on my wall. I've got a big cork board, for those that don't know, that sits in front of me up here where you can't see it. But it's loaded with single board computers and Arduinos and things. And one of them is a Tinker board, which was an open hardware, open source type project, which made FPGA. It's an FPGA board, and it kind of made it. It was one of the first boards that I can remember that made it accessible for people to start playing with. And I haven't been following the project since then, but I jumped on board because I was just so excited about all the possibilities that you can do with FPGAs. There are lots of great projects that use FPGAs to do emulation of old games. So you can actually buy an FPGA and you can put it in whatever mode you want. I want to put this in a SNES mode, or I want to put this in a, name your favorite system, N64 mode, and it will emulate that hardware fairly exactly and allow you to get the experience if you can't find one of those systems, or if you need to tweak the system in a way that you aren't able to do with the actual hardware. So yeah, I'm all in on FPGAs.
Yeah, I think we'll see even more as time goes by, as we're kind of seeing an open source liberation of FPGA toolchains, that they'll get used in more and more creative ways. Because again, this transition is kind of handing these tools out to more and more people. And if there's anything we know from the last 30 years of the internet and 30 years of open source, is that when everybody gets their hands on the tools, it gets crazy, the things that comes out of it, the creativity that gets unleashed.
Yeah, the biggest project, or the one I think that's most popular, at least in the retro community, is probably the Mister project. Mister has done a lot of work. It's not cheap necessarily. It's not like going down to a thrift store and finding an old computer. Sometimes you don't find them much there anymore, actually, but sometimes you still can. But it's not cheap. But what you get with it is, with Mister, is an opportunity to work with a community that's really highly invested and excited about emulating these old systems. So if you're really into it and you want to have one box that emulates all kinds of different systems, even more than you can like on a Raspberry Pi, then yeah, highly recommend folks checking out the Mister project.
So, okay, I could bring up my, a couple of things. One is, and I'm just wondering, we actually dispense with this fairly quickly. It was something that had possibly been on the docket for today. And speaking of open hardware, is RISC-V. And I don't know if you guys have thoughts about that, but somebody said to me recently that RISC-V is like as big a deal as it is that ARM has sort of leapfrogged Intel. RISC-V has the possibility of leapfrogging ARM. You guys have any thoughts about that?
I wouldn't say leapfrogging necessarily. There are a lot of. And there is a lot of buzz right now, right? I was just talking to a buddy of mine. He just bought a RISC-V system to play with. Small, inexpensive, powerful. I think it was like 180 megahertz or something. And so, it can do a lot. It's just like anything else. It's whether the community will galvanize around it. I think there's a lot of the community has bought in on ARM at this point, in no small thanks to the Raspberry Pi Foundation for what they're doing. So, and of course, all our phones run some sort of an ARM processor most of the time. So we'll see. We'll see where it goes. I think it's funny that this technology, this RISC technology, I don't know the complete history of RISC, but I know it goes back, quite a ways, really. And was used. I remember running RISC systems in the data center back in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. So it definitely goes back a ways, but it could be a cool thing. We'll just have to see what people do with it, right? Is it going to be like a super performance system, or is it going to be just another fad, basically?
One of the real interesting things about RISC-V in particular is that the entire I don't remember the term that they use, but essentially the kind of the top-down design of the processor is an entire open source standard. And so, you could go out and design a RISC-V processor, and you don't have to pay royalties to anybody. There's no ARM Foundation, there's no Intel, there's no AMD that you have to get to sign off on your design. You could, anybody can go out and, assuming that you have the money to fab it, you can go and fab your own RISC-V processor, which that's really the thing that has everybody so excited. And what's interesting about RISC-V is they're already out there. It's kind of like FPGAs. It's kind of like how Linux has been for the longest time. It's running on your toaster is the joke, and you just don't know it. Well, with RISC-V, it's probably running on your hard drive. At least one of the big hard drive manufacturers have started putting RISC-V processors in their hard drives as the hard drive management engine. And so it's out there. It's slowly, kind of gaining traction, and it could very well be the next big thing. You just have to see.
Yeah, I know at Sun. I was just going to say at Sun Microsystems, of course, Sun was a big RISC shop. So, a lot of their old systems were RISC-based. So I remember I wasn't on the system side. I was on the storage side of things at Sun, but I remember, that was the big thing. Every time a new chip came out, there was some little portion of the marketing, that would talk about the advantages of RISC, try to get people bought in on it.
I actually was on the sort of the promotion side of the Spark architecture. To go back all the way, I'd love to have David Patterson on the show sometime. He's the guy who came up with the term RISC at Berkeley in the 80s, I think it was, and still a major figure in that. But back when, and I don't know if we've covered this before on the show, but it's a fun topic, is that Sun at first couldn't get any. What I did is I was in charge of promoting Spark International. Spark International was convened by Sun as a customer base for basically their idea, and it was instruction set architecture. That's what Spark was, meaning here's the instruction set, you guys go build the hardware, right? And in fact, the first one was a gate array. It wasn't an FPGA, but it was a gate array that Fujitsu came up with, and it was big and it was hot and it ran and it did the job. But there was I forget, Cypress, LSI Logic, I think, was one. Something called Soulborn that was kind of like a clone of Sun at the time, out of Colorado. They were all involved in Spark International, and then, but we couldn't get any attention at first for Spark because all of the publications wanted to make the fight between Intel and Motorola, who were the leading CPU makers at that time. So we picked a fight with MIPS, and we said, no, it's really us versus MIPS here. I think it caught MIPS totally by surprise, but it did them a lot of good. They ended up getting a lot of sales out of it, actually. So that was that was my hack on it, which is also Spark International didn't have an office, so I actually got a phone line run to my office, and when anybody called Spark International, I would answer the phone at Spark International on my desk. So that was part of it.
That's
too.
Great.
Anyway, yeah, so we're getting down toward the end of this thing. So normally we go over how this has been. Maybe we could do that again. I don't know. This is our first time as this 3. How do you guys feel about how the hour went so far?
Too quickly. I think we're all pretty passionate about our the things that we're interested in. So for me, it's like, what, we're out of time already? Wait, we must have we've only been talking for 15 minutes, right? It's like, no, we're out of time. It's like, well, okay.
I mean, in a very real way, it's just like a group of friends getting together and chewing the fat about the stuff that they care about. It's been great. It's fun to see the things that you guys are thinking about and to get your kind of input and your viewpoint on the things that I care about. And, hopefully it's things that the community will be interested in and care about too.
Yeah, and we don't get a chance to, to have 3 or more of us with each other either, We're scattered. We do it one at a time. I say always here, not always. I've been here less than a year. Actually, you guys go back a whole lot farther than I do. But it's, and for me, it's still getting to know you guys, and it's been a lot of fun to do that. And I remember when I came into this thing last May, I think it was, I thought, I've got a big Rolodex. I can go through this thing. This will last forever. We blew through that Rolodex pretty fast. I mean, there's still some left.
Yeah.
But it's like, there are a lot of people to talk to out there. And but it's good to stop every once in a while and kind of check in with each other.
And I think it's nice to have, it's nice to just have this open chat. I know that, we've been focused on interviews since as long as I've been involved, because you can always go back and rewatch those, which is nice. But at the same time, there's a lot of great news that's coming out, and it's news like we covered today that's relatable. You can go back. I'm sure people will go back and listen to this and think about what was going on and hear some of the history. You can still learn from this. And I think having the roundtable discussion is a great idea. I think we should do it, not all the time, but certainly more often than we have in the past.
And I like learning from each other. I learned some things this morning. I did not even know there was an open FPGA. I mean, and I'd actually have forgotten about a RISC-V until just while we were talking about that. Oh, I can bring up RISC-V. That's an interesting thing. And the retro stuff is always interesting to me. I'm if I had more time, I would be doing that stuff myself. So. Yeah. So anything, we could go straight into promoting stuff. So I have nothing to promote. You guys tell us what you're working on, even though some of us already know it, but give it to us.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Go ahead, Jonathan. Oh, we're too nice. I'll go first. I'll go first
yeah.
As the senior person here. No, I already mentioned my channel on YouTube, Retro Hack Shack. If you're interested in some of the stuff we've been talking about today, go check that out. I really don't have a whole lot else to plug. If you're going to Developer Week, I'll be giving a talk at Developer Week on Friday morning, talking about some statistics, actually, that I worked on a big report that Sysdig put out talking about the statistics we were able to pull from our user base anonymously that show what the trends are in Kubernetes, container ecosystems, and security for Kubernetes. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, go to Dev Week this week and check out my talk on Friday.
Very cool. I will mention the other big public-facing thing that I do, and that's over at hackaday.com. Somehow, a couple of years ago, I talked them into letting me write for them, and they gave me a security article. Runs every week, Friday morning, so make sure to check that out. And then as I have time, I tend to like to cover the open source things over there too, so Linux hacks and other various goodies. So check it out over at hackaday.com.
Yeah, and I should say, as an old editor, you write good there, Jonathan. You're good at that. Not just good at talking and looking good, but you actually write well too. So that's not a small thing. So this has been great, guys. Thanks a lot. It's a weird way to end the show.
That's been great.
But anyway, thanks a lot for being with us this week. Next week we have Steve Klabnik of Rust. And Sean Powers is going to be the co-host on that one. So that's going to be a good one, and we look forward to that. So we'll see you next week. This has been FLOSS Weekly.
We do appreciate you watching this show right here on the TWiT network. If you want to make sure you are up to date on all things iOS, tvOS, watchOS, HomePod OS, all the OSs from Apple, you've got to check out iOS Today. Rosemary Orchard, the incredible Rosemary Orchard, and myself talk each week about the news for iOS, the best apps and games, and so much more. You've got to check out the show, and we do appreciate you for subscribing.